Hi, folks, and welcome back. We hope you've enjoyed this fantastic weekend of programming. I am so delighted to be here with Dr. Larry Burke. My name is Erin Aoyama. I'm a doctoral student in American Studies at Brown University, and I'm a current fellow at Minidoka National Historic Site. We have with us tonight Dr. Larry Burke to talk about what led to December 7th, 1941. Hi, Dr. Burke.
Hello, Erin.
Before I let you get going, I'm going to just read your brief bio so folks know a little bit more about you. So, Dr. Lawrence M. Burke II curates the U.S. Naval Aviation Collection at the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum. This collection of over 30 U.S. Navy and Marine Corps fixed-wing aircraft covers all eras of naval aviation from pre-World War I Curtiss N-9 trainer to the prototype for the next generation of Marine Corps aircraft, the Lockheed Martin X-35B. Dr. Burke researches military aviation, military technology more broadly, and military innovation. His dissertation examined the early history of U.S. military aviation, Army, Navy, and Marine Corps, from the Wright brothers' sale of their airplane to the U.S. Army in 1909 to the passage of the Air Corps Act of 1926. In particular, he was concerned with how each service developed its own doctrine regarding best use of the new technology and how interactions between services influenced this development. He's currently turning part of this dissertation into a book covering the period up to 1917, which is very exciting. Prior to coming to the National Air and Space Museum, Dr. Burke was a Secretary of the Navy Innovation History Postdoc Fellow at the United States Naval Academy, where he taught both the plebe or freshman U.S. Navy History survey course and an upper-level course in military innovation. So we are so delighted and lucky to have you here, Dr. Burke, to talk with us. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here and share some of this, which does actually come out of some of the lectures that I was giving at the Naval Academy. So all of your guests, your viewers who are tuning in, get a little bit of a view of what happens in classes there.
Wonderful. We'll see you after for a Q&A.
Okay. Well, so yes, thank you all for tuning in. Good afternoon, those of you in Hawaii. Good evening for those of you who might be in the continental states or on the East Coast, as is my condition. I do want to talk tonight about this notion of sort of the wider view of the Pearl Harbor attack, what went on, and the typical Pearl Harbor talk, at least I think so. And certainly we've had, several in the series that get away from the typical talk. But the typical talk focuses on the details of the attack. What forces were where, what time certain events happened, what weapons were used when. And, one of the things certainly in the United States that a lot of these stories emphasize, and even more so when you look at the movies, is that, this Japanese raid is presented as a surprise attack. Which in some ways it was, while in other ways, the U.S. should have seen it coming and been better prepared. In the extreme end of this, of course, are the idea that the President Roosevelt saw this coming and allowed it to happen because this is what would have brought or what did bring the U.S. into World War II. And the truth is, when you get down to it, and I hope to present some of this today, is, yes, there are some things that should have been seen coming, but other things really were a surprise. And, I'll get to that. As I say, what I want to talk about today is this idea of what led us to the Pearl Harbor attack. What led to Japanese airplanes over, Ford Island at 8 in the morning on December 7th, 1941. So in order to do this, I'm going to get into some geopolitics, and I've been told that, a lot of people might not know that term. Basically, all it means is the sort of intersection between the political relations and the geography where these actors are, where the nations are, what their relations are to each other, physically as well as politically. And so what I want to start with then is actually go all the way back to 1853, and if I could have that first slide. In 1853, the U.S. Commodore Matthew C. Perry reopens Japan to the world after almost 200 years of national isolation. And this was a self-imposed isolation imposed by the government, trying to cut themselves off from the modern world. But in 1853, Matthew Perry famously sort of kicks down the door, changes the internal politics so that those who are, in political power, who are interested in interacting with the wider world again, they now have the upper hand, and this begins a new era in Japan known as the Meiji Restoration. But you can see here some of the drawings that were made at the time, and these are, I believe, all Japanese drawings, their views of what this was. And in particular, that sort of top right, you see the black ship. It was known as Perry's Black Fleet. All of his ships were painted black. But one of the things that really caught Japanese interest was a little miniature railroad that Perry brought when he came back, I believe on the second time when he came back to actually do the formal interactions with the Japanese. So this incident reopens Japan, has Japan once again looking to the wider world, and as I say, becoming particularly interested in Western technology at the time, which is represented by our little miniature railroad. From isolation, then, Japan is really looking to become a Western-style economy. So they're looking to sort of leapfrog that 200 years that they've cut themselves off and get back into the thick of things. Now, unfortunately for Japan, the Japanese islands do not contain a whole lot of the natural resources that one would need for a westernized economy, even in the 1850s. Coal, iron ore, by the time you get into the 20th century, we're looking at petroleum, various petroleum products. None of that is available certainly not in industrial quantities in Japan itself. And so Japan begins looking to sort of Western style empire, because again, this is the 1850s. You're seeing the Western Europe establishing colonies all over the world in order to bring in these natural resources. And Japan was looking to be self-sufficient. It did not want to rely on other nations for this economy. And so it's looking for these other places where it can get these resources. If we can get to the next slide then. This desire for natural resources leads Japan to a number of different wars, including one with China in 1894 and 1895, with Russia in 1904 and 1905, and both of these over influence on the Korean Peninsula. And following the war with Russia, Korea becomes a protectorate of Japan in 1905, followed by full colony status in 1910. So Japan has access to some resources. But of course, even what's available in Korea is somewhat limited. And the Japanese are looking further south, in particular the Philippine Islands. And so the Japanese Empire is a little bit upset following the Spanish-American War in 1898, when the U.S. takes over the Philippines as its own colony. Now, at about this time, the U.S. begins recognizing that this Imperial Japanese ambitions may, in fact, lead the U.S. and Japan into conflict at some point. And the U.S. Navy begins planning for a possible war with Japan as early as 1911. These are the origins of what is famously known as War Plan Orange. Each U.S. was looking at potential conflict with a number of different nations. Each different nation had its own color code. So, for instance, Germany was black, so that was a War Plan Black. Should we have had to go to war against England, that was red. And in the late 30s, there's a recognition that it may not be a one-to-one thing, that it may be coalition warfare, and so these individual plans morph into the rainbow plans, where you've got multiple nations on each side. At any rate, so one of the interesting things then, and one that's not really expected, is that what's happening in the Pacific at this time is actually connected to what's going on in Europe at this time. So Germany is created as an independent country in the 1890s. Sorry, I forget the exact date of that. But the important thing here is that their chancellor, Otto von Bismarck, has this idea for what he calls the continental system. And it's a system of alliances where Germany can sort of balance the risk against other nations that might expect to attack it. What happens then when he dies, or when he retires rather, is that this alliance system sort of falls apart and Europe sort of reverts to its old system of partnerships and alliances. But one of the things is that it means that the UK actually no longer has an alliance with Russia. And the UK is concerned about what Russia might do if it decides to attack. And this leads them to actually ally with Japan in 1902. So this is the UK's effort to balance the threat of war with Russia in the West with the potential that, well, if Russia attacks to the West, Japan may attack from the East. So think twice about that. And so this means that when World War I does break out, which again is the result of this breakdown of Bismarck's system, Japan is actually part of the Allied coalition against Germany. And that's partially accidental, but partially Japan is really looking forward now to gaining control, assuming that the Allies win, that Japan is going to gain control of a lot of the German possessions in the Pacific. And in particular, they're looking at, they do in fact attack the German legation in China. So anyway, Japan is looking to gain from this, and again, they're looking to gain control over places with natural resources. And in this, they're somewhat disappointed in 1920 when the Treaty of Versailles finally finalized and ratified. That they don't get, Japan does not get as much out of the Treaty of Versailles as they were really hoping. They do get a number of island chains in the Pacific, but nothing that's really got that the resources that they need. So on top of this disappointment coming out of the First World War, you get the drive for international disarmament. There's this belief that one of the reasons for World War I was this massive arms race, particularly naval, where everyone was trying to build a bigger navy than the next guy, and that this just contributed to war breaking out. And so this leads to the Washington Naval Treaty of 1922, in which 5 nations, sort of the 5 most significant naval powers at the end of World War I, and that is the UK, the US, China, France, and Italy. So these 5 get together and they agree to limit how many ships they're going to build. Now, initially, this is just battleships. Eventually, it's extended to aircraft carriers and cruisers. But the big thing is that there is this ratio that's set up. And the idea is that, well, the US and the UK have wide-ranging responsibilities. And the US in particular needs to be in both the Atlantic and the Pacific. Whereas the Japanese only need to be in the Pacific, and the French and the Italians have sort of much more limited responsibilities for their navies. And this results in this ratio of 5 to 3 to 1.5 or 1.75, depending on which class you're looking at. And this was a ratio of tonnage to which each nation could build to. So the US and the UK got the 5, Japan only gets 3. Japanese were not really happy at this result. The treaty was agreed to on the basis, on the argument that, well, yes, the U.S. has 5 to Japan's 3, but if the U.S. splits its fleet, Atlantic and Pacific, then in the Pacific it's really 2.5 to 3 in Japan's favor. But as I say, the Japanese government is really not happy with that, and actually consider it a national humiliation, such that all of the diplomats that were involved in negotiating that treaty are either fired or assassinated by 1934. And the assassinations were actually part of another sea change, if you will, in the Japanese government. So the military, from Perry's opening, military had really had a strong influence in the Japanese government from that point. But following a number of assassinations beginning in 1932, mostly of some liberal businessmen, but also the prime minister at the time, this effectively put the military in charge of Japan. Now, as we'll see later, there's still sort of the power behind the power, if you will. And a little bit later, I'll talk about when they actually drop that facade and take direct control. But we see these assassinations, as I said, in 32, 34, of liberal businessmen, some of these politicians that were involved in the treaty. With this change in government, with the increase in military control over the Japanese government, the Japanese policy shifts very strongly towards self-sufficiency, not only in resources, but in national defense. They don't want to rely on alliances. They don't want to rely on diplomacy. It becomes paramount that they control their own destiny. And so we see, as part of this, Japan takes over Manchuria in 1932. I think we're ready for the next slide. Japan takes over Manchuria in 1932. The Second Sino-Japanese War begins in 1938, and some people mark this as the beginning of World War II, certainly in the Pacific. This is a war that does continue until 1945. And the U.S. is aiding China, France, UK, the Dutch, all countries that are opposing Japanese expansion in this area. And with the beginning of the Second Sino-Japanese War in 1938, that's when we see the U.S. begin to restrict exports to Japan. Why is this important? Well, Japan is actually heavily dependent on imports. Again, they don't have a lot of the natural resources they need. And with roughly 40% of their imports coming from the rest of Asia, and 40% of their imports coming from the US. And the imports from the US are things like scrap steel, iron, and especially oil. They're getting about 80% of their oil and petroleum products from the US at this point. So US cuts off export of, or restricts export of a lot of these militarily significant resources to Japan. So Japan is beginning to feel a little bit hemmed in. And then in 1940, the US has these annual fleet problems where they bring the entire fleet together and they go through some red versus blue exercises where, they split it off. Some of the fleet plays a fictional enemy, and fictional, of course, at this point really means Japan. But the point is that the fleet has been brought together. And at the end of the 1940 fleet problem in April, that fleet problem happens around Hawaii, interestingly enough. And once the exercise is over, rather than sending the fleet back to the East Coast, the U.S. keeps the fleet, and especially the battleship fleet, in Pearl Harbor. And this is specifically because we want to put pressure on Japan. Japan does indeed get that message, but it makes them feel even more hemmed in, that the noose is closing around their neck. Now, a little bit about the time this happens. Japan does actually enter into the tripartite pact with Italy and Germany. So we've got the East and West connected again. This is September 1940 when this is set up. So Japan is not part of this mutual defense pact before then. But again, Japan enters into it hoping that this keeps the U.S. neutral with the threat of a two-ocean war. So before we talked about, the UK allying with Japan to get that two-front war threat against Russia. Now we see Japan using that against the U.S., where if the U.S. attacks Japan, the Germans and the Italians will also come into it, and the U.S. will have to fight its own two-front war. So the Japanese figure they're hedging their bets, and they enter this alliance. They become part of the Axis. Now they get some immediate benefit out of this. So with the German occupation of France and the Netherlands and the besiegement of the UK in 1940 and the beginning of 1941, Japan sees an opportunity and coerces the Vichy French government, and Vichy France is that part of France which is not under direct German control after the Germans have taken over, but is under this sort of puppet government that the Germans allow to exist for a while anyway. So Japan forces Vichy France into acceding control of what was then known as Northern Indochina, what we now know as Vietnam, Thailand, or Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. Thailand is separate. But cedes to Japanese control of Northern Indochina. And again, the Japanese are doing this primarily for the resources that are there. Secondarily, it is a useful staging area towards the real prize, which is the Dutch East Indies, which is much of modern Indonesia. And that is a big producer of oil and rubber, tin, things like that, all these militarily useful things. You see this going on. The U.S., again, trying to head this off, is already beginning to cooperate with the Royal Navy, with the Dutch colonial government, and again, with the fall of the Netherlands in Europe, there's a sort of government in exile in the Dutch East Indies. So the U.S. is cooperating with them. The U.S. is sending support to China. Most famously, the Flying Tigers, the American First Volunteer Group, which is organized in 1941 with the first squadrons arriving in China that November. So we've got volunteer U.S. squadrons in China. We've got U.S. naval cooperation with British and Dutch navies in the South China Sea. We've got the U.S. fleet now parked in Hawaii. Japan is really feeling encircled and recognizing that its own desire to occupy these nations around the South China Sea will likely bring the U.S. into the war. But at the same time, they feel that going to war with the U.S. is inevitable. Now, in response to a then further Japanese occupation of the rest of French Indochina, the U.S. at this point cuts off all export of scrap iron and petroleum to the UK. And the colonial, to Japan, the UK and the colonial government of the Dutch East Indies follows suit. So Japan is getting no oil at all. Japan sees this embargo as tantamount to an act of war. And the U.S. had done this knowing that, the U.S. intelligence had gathered its information and come up with the calculations that by cutting off Japan, they could only operate their fleet on a wartime footing for about 6 months. And the assumption was that Japan would have to sue for peace at that point. Well, the Japanese actually had the same calculations, figured they can go to war for about 6 months, except that at that point, they really need to have taken over their own oil supply in the Dutch East Indies. So plans begin for the Japanese to go ahead and move into Malaya, modern Malaysia, the Dutch East Indies, and capture these supplies that they need. Now, of course, the other hang-up is if you look at where the Dutch East Indies are and where Japan is, what sits in the middle? The Philippines. The U.S. has a major base there. Now, again, as part of all of this, attempt to reduce warlike preparations, the U.S. has not been allowed to fortify that base in the Philippines. Nevertheless, the U.S. has a presence there, and if the U.S. can get its fleet there, it becomes an easy point to blockade and prevent the shipping of supplies from the Dutch East Indies back to Japan. So again, Japan is seeing war with the U.S. as increasingly inevitable. And the question is how to consolidate their defensive perimeter by occupying the Philippines, but still win the war, recognizing that in the long run, Japan is unlikely to win the war outright against the U.S. They've got to find a way to end it quickly. And this is where the idea comes up of attacking the Americans first, trying to put the U.S. out of the war before it can start. Now, the U.S. diplomats, U.S. military did not see this as a rational response to the situation facing the Japanese, so never really considered that this might be happening. But this was an idea put forth by the Japanese Admiral Yamamoto Isoroku, using the Japanese with the family name first. Yamamoto conceived this plan to disable the U.S. ability to make war versus Japan, at least for a while, by knocking out the U.S. fleet. Now, the plan was very risky, and it faced stiff opposition from other Japanese military officers, but Yamamoto was convinced that attacking the American Pacific Fleet at anchor was the only way to win a war against the United States. Now, he recognized that this would not be permanent, but in the amount of time it would take the U.S. to reconstitute its battle fleet, Japan would have time to consolidate and fortify its gains. And the expectation by the Japanese was that this would make the U.S. attempting to recapture or liberate these locations too difficult. That the U.S. would decide it was not worth going to war, that the U.S. would accede to what the Japanese had accomplished and say something like, okay, well, you got that, as long as you don't expand any further, we won't go to war. The Japanese also expected that losing their entire Pacific fleet in one go like that would be so devastating to the American psyche that the American public would lose all desire to go to war against Japan. Now, Yamamoto really had to push hard to get this plan accepted. And as I said, there was a lot of risk. It put the entire Japanese carrier force way out on a limb. At this point, carriers are seen as important, but they're also seen as being vulnerable. And so even in the U.S. exercises that I was mentioning, carriers were not allowed to sort of move independently. They were always tied very closely to the battleships, the line of battle, the main fleet, because they would protect their own carriers against the enemy battleships. And the assumption was that if you had a carrier versus a battleship, the carrier, especially multiple battleships, that the carrier was likely to lose. As long as one battleship could get within gunnery range of the carrier would be sunk. And so everybody is really nervous about sending all 6 Japanese carriers unsupported on this raid. But Yamamoto convinces them that no, the reward is worth the risk. They can do this, they can pull it off. And even if they lose 1 or 2 carriers, the Japanese have still essentially won this exchange. So the Japanese had initially set a deadline of October 15, 1941 to conclude negotiations. This is what the negotiations were. This is why they were negotiating in Washington, D.C. The U.S. was trying to get the Japanese to step back. The Japanese were trying to get the U.S. to accept that this was inevitable. And so going back and forth, U.S. wanted Japan to pull out of Indochina and China. Japanese obviously weren't going to do this. And the failure to make a deal by October 15th leads to a collapse of the coalition government in Japan. And this is the point where the military just takes over directly. They're tired of working behind, being the power behind the throne, if you will. This is the point where Tojo comes to power, and the military, it becomes a military government. The military is in charge. This new government sets a new deadline of November 25th. And remember November 25th, we'll come back to it in a moment. Now, the U.S., of course, was aware that the Japanese regarded war as inevitable. We were already reading the diplomatic codes, and the purple was the nickname for the code system. Magic was the nickname for the decoded intelligence that we could get. So we were reading these diplomatic codes, but we were not reading the Japanese Navy codes, JN-25B. So we weren't sure, we could not read what the Japanese Navy was saying to itself. We could only read what was going back and forth between the diplomats and Tokyo. So the U.S. was aware of this code phrase, east wind rain, in a Japanese weather report, which would indicate that U.S. negotiations had broken down. And this was actually an instruction for embassies around the world to burn their code books. Now, there is some debate whether this code phrase was ever actually broadcast. Although, interestingly, we do have a record of a similar phrase, west wind clear, which related to a breakdown in relations with the British. West wind clear was actually sent at least once on December 8th. So at any rate, Magic revealed that there was some kind of Japanese deadline on November 25th, but the U.S. didn't know what that deadline meant. Nevertheless, based on this intelligence and a statement from the Secretary of State at the time, Cordell Hull, that the negotiations were all but over, the American Chief of Naval Operations at the time, Admiral Harold Stark, sent what he called the war warning message on November 27th to all forces. However, it was expected that when war came, it would be a Japanese advance against either the Philippines, Thailand and the Malay Peninsula, or possibly directly south into Borneo. U.S. was getting no indication of any strikes further east of these locations. The Army Chief of Staff, George Marshall, sent a similar warning to the U.S. Army forces, but it said nothing about where strikes might be expected. Here we get back to sort of familiar territory that the Japanese had sent this 14-part message from Japan to its negotiators in Washington, breaking off the negotiations on December 7, 1941. But again, the U.S. was getting this, was intercepting the purple, decrypting it, getting the magic information out of it. So the U.S. was aware even before the Japanese presented this official notice that they were breaking off the negotiations. The U.S. was aware that these negotiations had been broken off. However, this was not an official declaration of war. This was just breaking off relationships. Now, the U.S. had considered the possibility that Japan might try to attack Pearl Harbor with some sort of aerial attack, but for the same reasons that much of the Japanese military thought it was risky, the U.S. also thought that such an attack would be incredibly risky, and the U.S. assumed that the Japanese would not be willing to take this risk. The assumption was that if an attack came at Pearl, it would be a result of fifth column activity, sabotage, local Japanese population rising up in advance of the presumed invasion, that these possibilities were much more likely than any aerial attack on Pearl Harbor. Furthermore, the U.S. expected that if the Japanese did attempt an aerial attack, it would come out of the Japanese-held Marshall Islands, which were southwest of Hawaii. So the U.S. is already looking in the wrong place. So we get back to what the Japanese are doing. Again, this high risk of sending out all 6 of their fleet carriers at the time being sent out without battleship support. And they recognize that if if this first air fleet, as they called it, encountered the U.S. battleships at sea, it would have been disastrous. So the Japanese recognized that absolute secrecy in the movement of this aerial force was an absolute requirement for success. No orders were to be sent over the radio. It wouldn't have mattered if the U.S. had broken the Japanese naval codes. Ultimate secrecy was maintained. Final orders to the ship's captains were delivered by hand before they left the pier. Now remember that 25th November date, the deadline for breaking off negotiations with the U.S. 25th November in the U.S. is the 26th of November in Japan, because we got to cross the date line. The 26th, the morning of the 26th of November, that is when the first air fleet left. And if we could get the next slide. No, I'm sorry, one more, please. There we go. So you can see at the upper left there, the carrier task force is leaving Japan, and they're leaving from way, way north. They're not leaving from their usual bases. So they're already leaving from far north. The fleet departed the anchorage on the 26th of November, as I said, and the orders were that the strike was to be considered on unless Tokyo deliberately, specifically issued recall orders over the radio. So the carrier task force is off on its own. It's not talking to anyone. It's not expecting to hear from anyone. Now, this is important because the U.S. at this point, since we hadn't broken the code, was relying mostly on traffic analysis. That is, what radio stations were broadcasting, how often were they broadcasting, could you look at anything to say, aha, this station broadcasts and then this one broadcasts, so maybe they're talking to each other. So the U.S. is looking at this. And the U.S. assumption was that if the carriers weren't broadcasting, it's because they were in their home ports. The U.S. at this point is also seeing a collection of the Army of amphibious ships preparing for strikes somewhere to the southwest. Remember that the U.S. is expecting these strikes in Malaya, possibly Borneo, Dutch East Indies, somewhere down there. And they assume, naturally, that that's where the Army is going. And if the Army is going there, that if the Japanese carriers do sortie, they will sortie in support of these invasions. So the U.S. is looking in that direction. They're not looking this far north. And in fact, the Japanese, the Kido Butai, the first air fleet, is taking a very far north track, as you can see here. They are trying to avoid the usual shipping lanes. They don't want to be stumbled across by some commercial vessel who then gets on the radio and says, hey, you'll never believe what I just saw. Because again, we'll reveal where they are to the Americans. And the other risk in this is that the Japanese fleet is fairly short range. The Japanese assumption was always that if it did come down to a battle, that battle at sea would be someplace fairly close to Japan. And so most of its carriers don't actually have the range to get all the way to Hawaii and back without refueling. Now, the U.S., of course, had been expecting much the same thing, that any battle would come close to the Japanese home islands. But that meant that the U.S. did have to plan to cover these long ranges. So in addition to having long ranges in the ships, the U.S. had also practiced a lot of refueling at sea. The Japanese had not done so much of that. And so this was another risk that they were taking, that in order to pull this off, they did have to refuel at sea. And if it didn't go well, somebody was going to run out of fuel. So that is sort of the status that we have leading up to the attacks in Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. You'll be hearing more about that tomorrow. I do, however, want to kind of skip over Pearl Harbor and talk about some of what happens immediately afterwards, because again, Pearl Harbor is not something in isolation that just happens. It's related to all these other things. So On the 8th of December, and again, we're on the other side of the date line, so it is happening the same day as the attacks on Pearl Harbor. In addition to the invasion of the Malayan Peninsula, and if we could get the next slide. Don't try reading all of this. I'll try to guide you through it. So we have the invasion of the Malay Peninsula that you can see there on the left. We also have Japanese land-based Army aircraft are striking the Philippines. Japanese troops are attacking Hong Kong. Japanese Army bombers attack Wake Island, which is U.S. And the Japanese actually make their first attempt to invade Wake Island on December 11th. The first landings in the Philippines occur on December 10th. December 14th, the first Japanese landings on Borneo. On January 11th, we see the first Japanese landing in the Celebes Islands. And then in February, we see Japanese landings in Sumatra and Java. So we see the Japanese have all of this lined up to go. They're trying to knock the U.S. out of the war until they can finish all of this invasion, consolidate their gains, and present this sort of defensive front. And hopefully the U.S., once it's prepared to come back to war, will say, you know what, it's not worth the effort, the cost in lives, the resources to try to reverse this and kick the Japanese out. So we see is the conclusion, Pearl Harbor is indeed the opening of hostilities between the U.S. and Japan, but it does not occur out of nowhere. It is intimately connected to the Japanese desire to control their own destiny by controlling their resources directly. They no longer want to be dependent on imports. Strategically, war between the U.S. and Japan was inevitable, and this was seen by both sides as pretty inevitable. Now, the U.S. thought it was somewhat less inevitable because of its assumptions of how the Japanese would respond to things, which turned out to be incorrect. And many of these incorrect assumptions contributed to the tactical success of the Pearl Harbor attack, including the U.S. looking in the wrong direction. Again, the assumption, even after the attack, the assumption was that this attack had come from the Southwest, from Japanese bases in the Marshalls. And if we can go back one slide, and you can see that track of where the Lexington and the Enterprise were. The Lexington on December 7th is actually set south because it's assumed that that's where the Japanese fleet is. You know, the idea that they've come this northern way, completely unexpected. The U.S. is looking entirely to the south, the southwest. So we have that surprise there. Now, the fascinating thing about this, and I'll leave you with this, so that the Japanese demonstrate what can be gained when carriers operate independently. The curious thing is that this is really the last time they do this until we get to the Battle of Leyte, at which point the carriers are no longer effective as a fighting force, but they are sent out on their own. They're a decoy. That's really the only other time that the carriers are operating so independently of the rest of the fleet. So the irony is that the U.S. actually faces a decision after Pearl Harbor. U.S. Navy can either wait until that 6 months until we've got the U.S. Battleships reconstituted and can go out in the kind of naval battle the U.S. was expecting to fight. But that means 6 months of doing nothing, letting the Japanese run free. Or the U.S. can learn to operate its carriers independently the same way the Japanese just did. And the interesting thing about this is that the U.S. finds out fairly quickly that while there is a lot of risk, it's not as high as they had thought based on these interwar combat games, and that there are things that can be done to lessen the danger to these independent carrier strike forces. And so for the rest of the war, you see the U.S. carriers operating almost entirely independently. They do get battleships as they come out back online, as more battleships are built and they're sent to the Pacific, but they're not used the way they expected to be. The carriers remain the primary striking force, going out, doing quick raids, disappearing again, and coming together for these handful of really major fleet-on-fleet actions, which again, up to the American attempt to liberate the Philippines with the landings in the Leyte Gulf, that we're seeing that as pretty much all carrier versus carrier battles. So it is something very interesting going forward, and maybe an unexpected lesson of the Pearl Harbor attack. So with that, I'm done, and we'll see what kind of questions you might have.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Burke, for that really fascinating history lesson, essentially. A reminder to folks who are watching along with us, please do leave your questions in the chat. We have about 10 minutes to answer, and I know there's already one that's come in, but I wanted to ask, and you sort of started getting to this towards the end there, but how do you think about this geopolitical context that you've just laid out so wonderfully for us? How does that help you, or when you were teaching those classes, how does this help us understand World War II differently, or maybe the post-war world, or more clearly, to have a sense of, not just the start of December 7th, but going back as you have just done for us?
Yeah, I think there's a tendency in a lot of history to make history more understandable by breaking it into pieces. And so we do see, a lot of history will concentrate on what's going on in Europe, and it treats what's going on in the Pacific as something entirely different. Mm-hmm. And there are certainly good reasons for doing this, but it's also important to remember that they are not completely isolated. There are these connections. As I said, it's how many people are surprised that the Japanese, the U.S., and the Great Britain were allies in World War I? I think nobody knows that. So what changes then going into World War II, right? And seeing this big picture and recognizing that it's not just U.S. versus Japan, it's what's going on with UK, with other Europeans in the Pacific, with China, relationships with China, and again, relationships with what's going on in Europe, and the sudden, everyone knows that the Axis powers in World War II were Italy, Germany, and Japan. But I don't know that anyone really thinks about how late Japan came to this or why.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And I think even what you were saying about the U.S. anticipating that if there were to be an attack at Pearl Harbor, it would be a fifth column effort. It would just, I hadn't heard, that history articulated in that way, and thinking about what then happened domestically within the United States after this attack as well. So we do have some questions from the audience I want to make sure we get to. So the first question that's come in, when did the Americans learn that the Japanese struck from the north?
Ooh, that is a good question. And I will be honest, I'm not entirely certain when we figured that out. There were some hints. One of the things that we do have in our collection that I've spoken about many times, and I'm not sure if the link has been posted by your folks with this, but we do have an airplane in the Smithsonian collection that was actually at Pearl Harbor on 1941, December 7th, and it is a Sikorsky JRS, which is a little utility plane. And as part of the Japanese attack, the first wave was really attacking anything on the ground that might be able to threaten or even find the Japanese fleet. But because of that, though, it meant that they sort of missed this area on Ford Island where this utility squadron was, because these are not combat airplanes. And what happened was that basically, I think like 10 minutes after the last Japanese airplane was overhead, they had gotten flight crews together in these JRSs, and there were about 10 of them, 9 or 10, as well as some smaller utility aircraft, and I think 2 surviving PBY Catalinas, which of course would have been the long-range search aircraft for the Navy. But these are the PBYs, again, are sent to the southwest. The assumption is that's where they are. Covering their bases, they do send these JRSs north, And famously, they have no inherent defense. They grab guys running around on base, some of whom had just escaped from burning battleships on Battleship Row, handed them 1903 single-shot Springfield rifles, sat them in the doors at the back end of the aircraft, and said, "If you see an enemy plane, try to hit it." And they sent these folks out. They sent them out in the less likely directions. And there is a story of one of them, and I can't remember if it's actually ours or not. One of them actually coming across a stray Japanese fighter plane that is on its way north, and the assumption is that the Japanese pilot did not shoot them down because multiple possible reasons, could be any or all of them, recognized that they weren't really a threat, that they were flying in the wrong direction to actually encounter the rest of the Japanese fleet. The Japanese pilot may, in fact, had not had any ammunition left, and may have been running low on fuel and said, "It's not worth wasting what I've got left. I've got to get back to my carrier so I can land safely." So there were hints, and of course, looking back on it, the famous radar track of seeing the Japanese fleet Japanese air fleet coming in and being mistaken for B-17s from the mainland. There were hints at that. So I'm not sure when exactly the U.S. figured out that that's what had happened, but I would imagine it was not too long afterwards they could put these things together.
That's great. Another question. I'm sorry, I'm hearing an echo. I'm hoping you're not hearing that. Was the Japanese bombing of Guam hours after Pearl Harbor accidentally left out of the timeline, or did I miss that when you mentioned it?
No, I did not mention it. I think it might have been in the small print in one of the maps that I showed. Yeah, the Japanese were making a number of moves beyond what I mentioned. They were attacking. They attacked Wake. They attacked Guam. If you look at where Guam is, it's in the middle of an area that the Japanese otherwise controlled. So again, this was one of these U.S. bases that the Japanese were interested in neutralizing. And certainly, well, anyway, not sure where I was going.
Too much knowledge.
Guam was part of it. There were a lot of other minor attacks that were made in the hours following.
And another kind of technical date question for you from Thomas Kurihara. When were the U.S. carriers deployed before December 7th?
Right. So as you saw in that Japanese map showing the track of the Kido Butai, it also showed the U.S. carriers. The Enterprise was on its way back from delivering extra fighters to Wake Island. Again, this is part of the broader preparations for possible war with Japan. So the Enterprise was actually on its way back into harbor. Had the Japanese delayed about 2 hours, Enterprise might have been back in port. And in fact, coming back into port, the Enterprise had sent some of its long-range SDB dive bombers back into port, many of which were shot down because the Americans on the ground were shooting at anything in the air. They were not discriminating. And this is despite after the first Dauntless is shot down trying to land at Ford Island and getting on the radio and saying, don't shoot, we're Americans." I think only one of them actually landed safely. The other 11 or so were, if not shot down, at least damaged on their way into landing. The Lexington was on its way on a similar mission to deliver fighters to Wake Island. It turned around when the attack happened, so it did not deliver those fighters. And I believe Saratoga was the third carrier assigned to the Pacific at that point. But Saratoga was actually back on the West Coast undergoing some routine maintenance.
Thank you, and thanks for that question, Thomas. One last audience question here. In an alternate scenario where the US does not have major influence over the Philippines, would the Japanese still have considered the attack, assuming the trade embargo was put into place?
Ooh, that's a good question. Yeah, alternate history is tricky because it depends on so many things. I guess the next question that has to be asked is, okay, if the U.S. does not have control of the Philippines, who does? Do the Spanish still have control? Do the British have control? Did the Japanese take control? Do they have control already? Obviously, if the Japanese are controlling the Philippines, it's less of an issue. However, I think you're still looking at if anyone else is controlling the Philippines. I think the U.S. is still looking at a Japanese occupation of the Philippines being yet another provocation that they need to respond to. Excuse me.
That's great. Well, thank you so much for this fantastic and very thorough background and geopolitical context. It's really the perfect way to end the interactive programming for this weekend, I think, and get us ready for tomorrow, which I'm going to invite Kelsey Larson from NPS on to give us a little bit of a lead into tomorrow's programming. Hi, Kelsey.
Hi. Well, thank you all for joining a weekend full of programs that have showed us a wide range of stories beyond Pearl Harbor. We appreciate our virtual audience engagement with your participation. Now that we've learned from Dr. Burke and the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum about what led up to the attack, we look ahead to tomorrow. Tomorrow, December 7th, marks National Pearl Harbor Remembrance Day, and we will commemorate the 79th anniversary of that date, which will live in infamy. Please join our annual virtual broadcast tomorrow. The ceremony is presented by the National Park Service and United States Navy. It takes place at 7:45 a.m. Hawaii time, which is 9:45 Pacific or 12:45 Eastern. The live stream will be presented on a variety of platforms, including here on YouTube. We'll put links in the chat. As we conclude, I think about how 79 years ago tonight, those on Oahu went to bed, not knowing the horrors of war that the next morning would bring. Please join us tomorrow as we honor the sacrifices of the service members and civilians who exhibited exceptional courage under fire and who thus served above and beyond the call. I invite you to reflect upon the impact of December 7th, 1941, that it had on millions of people, and how many stories are forever intertwined because of it, connected beyond Pearl Harbor and beyond World War II. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kelsey. It's a beautiful way to end. Thank you, Dr. Burke, for your time and sharing so much of your knowledge and wisdom with us. And thank you, Kimiko, backstage. Thank you, all of you, for joining and for your wonderful questions. I hope you have a wonderful rest of the day or night, and see you tomorrow for the commemoration.
Thank you so much.